Important notice. The narration in this video is generated by artificial intelligence. The script is an original creation and not an actual recording. It dramatizes the thinking of Richard Feynman, based on his works, to clearly explore his ideas. Have you ever wondered what really happens when the door to an important meeting closes? What gets said, or more importantly, what gets ignored, muffled by the convenience of a more palatable narrative? On January 28, 1986, the world watched, live and in utter horror, as the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated 73 seconds after launch, turning a crew of 7 heroes into a cloud of smoke and debris against the blue Florida sky. The official narrative that emerged almost instantly was that of a tragic and unpredictable accident, the inevitable price of progress on the final frontier of human exploration. We accepted this story. We mourned the lost astronauts, praised NASA's resilience, and reaffirmed our belief in the nobility of the cause. But what if this narrative was, in itself, a smokescreen, a carefully constructed public relations layer to hide a much darker, systemic, and disturbing truth? What if the catastrophe wasn't an unpredictable accident, but the mathematical result of a culture of self-deception, where desperate warnings from engineers were methodically silenced, and the truth was sacrificed on the altar of ambition and schedules? The central problem is that we have been taught to trust authority, to believe press, releases and official statements from venerable institutions like NASA. We see the badges, the uniforms, and the titles, and assume that competence and honesty are inherent. This blind trust is a flaw in our own operating system, a vulnerability that makes us susceptible to manipulation. Let's categorically reject this comfortable, sanitized version of events. The story of the Challenger disaster isn't primarily about a faulty piece of rubber. It's about a flawed system of thought. It's a brutal and timeless lesson in how organizations, even the most brilliant and admirable, can rot from the inside out when honest communication fails and truth becomes an inconvenient obstacle to managerial goals. And to expose this institutional rot, it took a complete outsider, a man whose mind operated on a different plane, a physicist who thought with a childlike, brutal clarity, and who despised jargon, empty authority, and self-deception more than anything else in the universe. His name was Richard Feynman, and he didn't travel to Washington on a mission to save NASA's reputation or participate in political theater. He was interested in one thing, inflexible and non-negotiable: reality. I promise you that by the end of this video you will not only understand in technical detail why the Challenger actually exploded, but more importantly, you will master the mental tool that Feynman used to demolish NASA's wall of lies and evasions. This is not an esoteric tool for Nobel Prize-winning physicists. It is a weapon of clarity that anyone can and should use to cut through the fog of bureaucracy, marketing, and misinformation in their own life. To fully understand how Feynman succeeded where so many others failed, we need to take a deliberate step back, away from the twisted metal of the Challenger and Washington politics, to a fundamental principle that defined every aspect of his life and thought. The story, as told by Feynman himself on several occasions, goes back to his childhood in Queens, when his father, Melville, took him for walks in the Catskills woods. While other children's parents taught them to identify and name birds, Feynman's father taught him something infinitely deeper and more lasting. He explained that knowing the name of a bird in every language in the world, Portuguese, English, Chinese, or Swahili, teaches you absolutely nothing about the bird itself. You will know a lot about humans and what they call things in different cultures, but you will remain completely ignorant about what the bird does, why it pecks its feathers, how it builds its nest, how it migrates thousands of miles. This seemingly simple lesson about the difference between nomenclature and knowledge was the seed of his genius. Feynman learned early on to distinguish with relentless clarity between knowing the name of something and knowing something. This distinction became the sharp razor with which he would cut through countless complex and pretentious problems throughout his life. This childhood philosophy, absorbed in the woods of New York, was not merely a charming anecdote to be told in interviews. It became the cornerstone, the unshakable foundation of his entire scientific and philosophical approach. While many of his colleagues in theoretical physics felt perfectly comfortable navigating the abstract seas of pure mathematics and the manipulation of symbols, Feynman always felt a visceral need to anchor each equation, each concept, in tangible physical reality. He needed to see the problem, to feel how the gears of nature meshed. His famous diagrams, which revolutionized particle physics, were not just calculation tools. They were tools of understanding, simple visual representations of incredibly complex interactions that allowed him to see the physics behind the mathematics. This insistence on fundamental understanding, rather than merely formal proficiency, markedly set him apart. He wasn't satisfied with knowing that the equations worked. He needed to understand why they worked, what physical reality they were describing. This made him impatient and, at times, openly disdainful of colleagues who recited axioms or textbook definitions without a visceral and functional understanding of what they were saying. He saw this as a form of intellectual dishonesty. This allergy to superficial knowledge and empty authority would put him on a direct collision course with the culture that had taken hold at NASA. The agency's bureaucracy in early 1986 was the perfect antithesis of Feynman's philosophy. It was an organization that had fallen dangerously in love with its own names, its own acronyms, and its own procedures. The intellectual enemy Feynman would encounter was not a malicious individual or a movie villain, but something far more insidious. A system, an organizational culture where communication was filtered through so many hierarchical layers that the truth was diluted at every step, like a drop of ink in a bucket of water. Crucial information from the frontline engineers, the people who really understood the birds, the O-rings, the temperatures, the material tolerances, had to climb up a chain of managers who were more concerned with budgets, launch schedules, and above all, public relations. They had become experts in presentations, not engineering. They knew the names of everything. O-ring erosion, soot blow-by. But they had completely missed the terrifying connection to what those names actually represented in the physical world. A vital rubber O-ring that was being burned and failing. This deadly separation between name and reality was the original sin that doomed Challenger, and it was precisely the kind of intellectual sin Richard Feynman was born to expose. He was about to enter a world that no longer understood its own birds, a world that had traded knowledge for nomenclature. The intellectual weapon he would wield against this bureaucratic wall was not forged in the high-tech laboratories of Caltech, but in the furnace of his own growing frustration in Washington. Upon arriving to join the Rogers Commission, the presidential committee charged with investigating the disaster, he immediately found himself immersed in a swamp of formalities, evasions, and obfuscation. He was forced to attend endless briefings where NASA officials and Air Force generals spoke in an impenetrable dialect of acronyms and jargon. They presented complex organizational charts, process flow charts, and statistical risk projections that seemed designed more to impress and confuse than to enlighten. Feynman's frustration grew with each passing hour. He wasn't learning anything at all about why the Challenger exploded. He was only learning about NASA's organizational structure and reporting procedures, which to him was completely irrelevant to the physical problem at hand. It was this intense frustration that led him to abandon official protocol. He realized that the standard approach of listening to formal testimonies and reading summary reports would be completely useless. The truth wasn't just absent, it was being actively obscured by the very structure of the investigation and the language used by NASA management. He decided that if he couldn't get clear, direct answers at the top of the pyramid, he would go to the bottom, to the engineers, the technicians, the people whose hands were dirty with grease and whose minds were full of real test data, not optimistic administrative projections. The intellectual weapon that emerged from this decision was, in essence, a radical and ruthless simplicity. It was the merciless application of the question his father had taught him to ask decades earlier. What do you mean by that? And how do you know that? He defined for himself a new method of investigation that he would apply with the precision of a surgeon. First, completely ignore the hierarchy. Speak directly to the people who do the real work. Second, be wary of any information that comes in the form of a summary, slide presentation, or press release. Demand the raw data, the original reports, the test notes. Third, and most crucially, translate all technical jargon into simple and understandable language. If a manager talked about O-ring erosion, Feynman wanted to know, do you mean the rubber ring is burning and falling apart? If they talked about a mission risk of 1 in 100,000, he would ask with biting curiosity, how exactly did you calculate that number? Show me the math and the assumptions. This weapon wasn't complex. On the contrary, its strength lay in its absolute refusal to accept complexity as a substitute for understanding. It was a relentless demand for intellectual honesty and physical evidence, and he was about to point it at the heart of NASA's culture of self-deception, a place where such simple, direct questions hadn't been asked or welcomed for a long time. The main stage for the conflict was the Rogers Commission hearing room, an environment that exuded power, solemnity, and formality. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the chairs were imposing, and the air was heavy with the weight of national tragedy and intense political pressure. On one side of the long table sat the members of the committee, revered figures like astronaut Neil Armstrong, decorated generals, and industry leaders, including the somewhat disheveled figure of Feynman. On the other side sat the high-ranking NASA officials, men in suits with serious expressions, ready to defend the honor and competence of their organization. The atmosphere was tense, but tightly controlled. Television cameras broadcast every word to a nation eager for answers, a nation that wanted to believe in its heroes and its institutions. However, beneath this facade of diligent and meticulous investigation, an elaborate charade was unfolding. NASA officials, with their well-rehearsed presentations and polished slides, spoke of the robustness of the systems, the redundancy of safety procedures, and the inherently risky and unpredictable nature of space exploration. They used language that was both highly technical and curiously vague, creating a shield of jargon that was almost impossible for a layperson, a journalist, or a politician to penetrate. They were building a fortress of words to protect the institution. Feynman, however, was no layperson. He was a world expert at detecting pseudo-knowledge and confused thinking. He listened, growing increasingly impatient as the truth was carefully managed, packaged, and presented in a way that made it unrecognizable, pushing it away from everyone in the room and the audience watching at home, waiting for an honest answer that never came. The loose thinking that Feynman witnessed was on full and glorious display, day after day. A high-level manager, for example, would present a slide showing the projected failure rates for various components of the space shuttle. He would point with a laser pointer to the number associated with the O-rings of the solid fuel rockets, a fantastically optimistic number, such as 1 failure in 100,000 launches. He would speak with unwavering confidence about the safety margin and the redundancy factors. What he conveniently failed to mention was that this number was not based on rigorous empirical testing in the real world, but on a computer model, a theoretical simulation that made optimistic assumptions and actively ignored field test data, showing the O-rings failing at low temperatures. The engineers who built and tested the O-rings knew the risk was much, much higher, perhaps as high as 1 in 100, a monumental difference. But this ugly, inconvenient, and alarming information never made it into the manager's slide presentation. Instead, the committee heard perfectly circular reasoning. The flight was safe because the components met the safety criteria, and the safety criteria were considered adequate because NASA had established and approved them. It was a closed, self-referential system of logic, immune to external evidence that might disturb it. It was like trying to discuss a patient's health with a hospital administrator who refuses to speak to the doctors and only reads the billing reports. Feynman's perspective amidst this theater of the absurd was that of a naturalist observing an unknown tribe with bizarre and incomprehensible rituals. He sat for days, largely in silence, furiously scribbling in his notebook, a disheveled and somewhat eccentric figure among the men in uniform and suits. His patience was a tool. He wasn't just listening to the words, he was observing the patterns, the omissions, the hesitations, the body language. He noticed the glaring disconnect between the manager's absolute confidence and the desperately vague nature of their explanations. They spoke with great authority, but when pressed for technical details, they resorted to empty phrases like, "the analysis indicates," or "the team consensus was," or "we followed standard procedure." Feynman knew that science doesn't work through consensus. It works through evidence and conflict of ideas. The crucial moment of his silent observation came when he began to hear whispers and hints from unofficial sources. A crucial tip came from General Kutina, another member of the commission, who suggested that Feynman investigate the effect of cold weather on the O-rings, a concern that engineers at Morton Thiokol, the rocket manufacturer, were desperately trying to communicate. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in Feynman's mind with terrifying clarity. The fundamental flaw wasn't just jargon, it was the active suppression of crucial information. The tribe wasn't just speaking a strange language. Its leaders were actively ignoring the warnings of their own more experienced hunters, who were shouting that the tiger was lurking in the tall grass. The tension in the courtroom on February 11, 1986, was therefore palpable, even if most of those present didn't know why. Feynman, who until then had been a relatively quiet observer, knew that the theater of carefully scripted presentations needed to be dramatically interrupted. He had spent the previous night and morning doing his own research, talking to lower-level engineers and technicians, completely bypassing NASA's official chain of command. He now understood the problem in simple, irrefutable physical terms. The rubber sealing rings, known as O-rings, which were supposed to seal the joints of solid fuel rockets, became rigid and lost their elasticity in cold temperatures. The morning of the Challenger launch was extraordinarily cold, well below the temperatures for which the rings were tested or certified. While a high-ranking NASA official was on the podium, once again discussing risk models and system reliability in abstract, reassuring terms, Feynman decided it was time. He felt the truth wouldn't emerge through more verbal questioning. The wall of jargon, plausible deniability, and bureaucracy was simply too thick. He needed something visual, something undeniable, something that could cut through the corporate fog and speak directly not only to the commission, but to the millions watching at home, bewildered. The timing of his intervention was no longer a matter of choice. It was a moral necessity, a duty to the fallen astronauts and to the truth itself. The climax came so unexpectedly and with such shocking simplicity that it froze the room and became one of the most iconic moments in 20th century scientific history. Feynman, with the permission of the committee chairman William Rogers, interrupted the testimony. He didn't ask a complex question. He didn't cite an obscure report. Instead, he addressed an assistant and asked for a glass of ice water and a small sample of an O-ring, which he had obtained himself. While the room watched in confused silence, Feynman picked up a small pair of C-clamps and squeezed the rubber sample to demonstrate its normal elasticity and resilience at room temperature. Then he submerged the O-ring and the clamps in ice water for a few minutes, continuing to calmly talk about the importance of the material's resilience in ensuring a proper seal under pressure. The tension increased with each second of silence. Then he removed the clamps from the ice water. With the TV cameras giving a dramatic close-up, he removed the O-ring from the clamps. But this time, the ring did not return to its original shape. It remained compressed, rigid, and lifeless. It did not expand. The rubber had lost its essential property. In a moment of pure theatrical and pedagogical genius, Feynman had demonstrated the Challenger's fatal flaw to the entire world, not with a complex equation or a legal argument, but with a glass of water and a piece of rubber. The physics of the disaster was no longer hidden in 1,000-page technical reports. There it was, cold and undeniable for all to see, a simple truth that no amount of jargon could hide. The immediate result was a stunned, heavy silence in the large hearing room. The NASA official on the podium was visibly shaken, speechless. The committee members stared, first at the lifeless piece of rubber in Feynman's hand, and then at the pale faces of the NASA administrators seated at the table. In that instant, the aura of infallibility and authority they had projected for days completely evaporated. All their slide presentations, risk charts, and confident assurances were exposed as irrelevant at best and misleading at worst, in the face of such a simple and devastating physical demonstration. It was impossible to argue against physics demonstrated in a glass of ice water. The opponent's failed attempt to respond was almost as revealing as the demonstration itself. When questioned about what Feynman's demonstration meant, the official could only stammer about the need for further study and analysis. But the damage to his credibility was done. The bureaucratic house of cards had crumbled under the weight of a single physical fact. Feynman had not only identified a technical problem, he had exposed a deep and dangerous cultural flaw. He proved that NASA leadership either didn't understand the most basic physics of its own equipment, or, far worse, understood it perfectly and chose to ignore it in the name of the schedule. The search for a technical scapegoat had ended abruptly. The search for managerial accountability had only just begun, all because of one man who refused to be intimidated by authority and insisted on seeing the proof with his own eyes. The universal lesson that emerged from the melting ice in Feynman's glass was profound and transcended aerospace engineering. It was a lesson about the nature of knowledge and the importance of intellectual honesty. He exposed the fundamental difference between truly knowing something, what he called real knowledge, and simply knowing the name of something, or verbal knowledge. NASA's narrative might be beautiful and inspiring, but nature doesn't care about narratives. As he stated with cutting clarity in his report, contextualizing the problem at the heart of the agency, reality has to come first. In his words, for a technology to succeed, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be deceived. What he was saying here was a direct and cataclysmic attack on NASA's culture. They had become so proficient at managing public perception that they had forgotten that their opponent was not Congress, but the immutable laws of physics. This lesson, however, is not merely a critique of a government agency from decades ago. It transforms into an actionable and incredibly powerful tool for each of us. How many times in our own professional and personal lives have we encountered the equivalent of an acceptable risk? A project manager who assures you that a deadline is challenging but achievable, despite warnings from the team that is actually doing the work. A financial advisor who uses complex jargon to sell an investment product you don't fully understand. A politician who promises a simple solution to a complex problem, trusting that no one will check the details. Feynman's tool is your license to say, wait a minute, explain this to me in simple terms, show me the evidence. You can apply it when reading the terms and conditions of a contract, asking, what does this really mean for me if things go wrong? You can use it in a work meeting, challenging an optimistic assumption. What data do we have to support this projection? Demanding clarity is not a sign of ignorance. It is a sign of intellectual strength. It is the refusal to allow others to think for you. Extend this lesson beyond our individual lives, and you will see that Feynman's battle at NASA is a microcosm of a much broader cultural conflict. We live in an age of manufactured complexity, where language is routinely used not to clarify, but to obscure, control, and intimidate. The food industry sells us naturally flavored food products. The tech sector offers us synergistic ecosystem solutions, and financial institutions trade synthetic collateralized debt obligation derivatives. It's all noise designed to make us feel small and ignorant, to discourage us from asking the simple, obvious questions. The culture Feynman fought against, a culture that punishes messengers of inconvenient reality and rewards architects of convenient narratives, is more alive than ever. It thrives in boardrooms, government corridors, and social media feeds. A society that cannot distinguish fact from fiction, that cannot heed the warnings of its engineers, is, like the Challenger, on a trajectory of disaster. The question is whether we will have the courage to demand the truth. This is where ownership of that intellectual weapon is transferred to you. Feynman wasn't a Superman, he was just stubbornly curious and intellectually honest. Empowering yourself with his mindset means accepting that "I don't know" is one of the most intelligent phrases you can utter. The disconnect he found at NASA was so vast it was almost comical. He discovered that the people who actually knew the risks were completely separate from the people who made the decisions. It was this observation that led him to one of his most shocking conclusions, which he presented with mathematical precision, highlighting the chasm between perception and reality. As he wrote, "It appears that there are enormous differences of opinion as to the probability of a failure with loss of vehicle and human life. Estimates range from approximately 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000. The highest figures come from active engineers and the very low ones from management. This wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was proof of two different worlds, one where the risk was real and imminent, and another where it was a convenient statistical abstraction. Exposing this gap is the task of every critical thinker. The search for truth, as Feynman demonstrated, is not a cold academic exercise. It is a passionate, profoundly human, and ultimately optimistic pursuit. It is based on the belief that the universe is fundamentally comprehensible, that puzzles have solutions, and that reality, however harsh, is always preferable to the most comfortable illusion. Feynman's legacy lies not only in his diagrams or his Nobel Prize. It lies in his unwavering insistence on honesty, especially honesty with himself. The story of the challenger is a grim reminder of what happens when we deceive ourselves, when we allow desire, hope, and political pressure to overcome cold, honest observation. But Feynman's investigation is a beacon of hope. It shows us that an individual, armed only with logic, curiosity, and the courage to appear foolish, can indeed topple empires of falsehood. He left us with a guiding principle, perhaps the most important of all, to protect us from our own capacity for self-deception, the foundation of all scientific integrity. The first principle is that you must not deceive yourself, and you are the easiest person to deceive. This is the ultimate lesson. The battle for truth begins within ourselves.